Part three, y'all, of the real history of slavery. Today we continue addressing the issue of abolition and uncovering the truth, what really went down, or the stuff that you're often not told regarding slavery. Let's go.
But out of this process came some who began to see slavery as an intolerable evil. Quakers were the first religious group to find slavery morally intolerable, a threat to their own eternal salvation by its members. In England as well, Quakers were the first to require members of their congregations to cease being slave owners. Evangelicals in the Anglican Church, notably William Wilberforce in Parliament, joined the Quakers and took the issue to the general public with a decades-long political struggle to get the British government to ban the trading of slaves. Only optimists thought this possible at the time, and even the leaders of the anti-slavery movement did not at first attempt the direct abolition of the institution of slavery itself, hoping instead that stopping the buying and selling of human beings would dry up the source and cause slavery as an institution to wither on the vine. At this juncture in history, Britain was the world's largest slave trader, and the powerful vested interests which this created were able to roundly defeat early attempts to get Parliament to ban the trade. In the long run, however, such powerful opposition to the proposed ban, combined with equal tenacity on the other side, simply dragged out the political struggle for decades, making ever wider circles of people aware of the issue. Something that had never been a public issue before now became a subject of inescapable and heated controversy for years on end. Slavery could no longer be accepted as simply one of those facts of life that most people do not bother to think about. The long, drawn-out political controversy meant that more and more people had to think about it, and many who began to think about slavery turned against it. Eventually, such strong feelings were aroused among the British public that anti-slavery petitions with unprecedented numbers of signatures poured into Parliament from around the country, from people in all walks of life, until the mounting political pressures forced not only a banning of the international slave trade in 1808, but eventually swept the anti-slavery forces on beyond their original goals toward the direct abolition of the institution of slavery itself. Nor was this a transient phenomenon. For more than a century, these political forces were so unremitting that no British government of any party could ignore them, and even British politicians and colonial officials with no personal sense of a need to ban slavery were nevertheless forced further in that direction by political pressures. Not only were Britons forbidden to trade or hold slaves, the British Navy intercepted slave ships from other nations on the high seas, set the slaves free, and confiscated the ships. Only Britain's overwhelming power made this possible, and even then not against a powerful nation like France, but only extraordinary political pressures at home made it necessary. Moreover, this was a moral crusade continually fanned by reports from British missionaries in Africa and elsewhere, as well as by anti-slavery sentiments from other sources. Queen Victoria told Harriet Beecher Stowe that she had wept when she read Uncle Tom's Cabin. Yet one of the signs of our own times is that intellectuals have made desperate but futile efforts to depict the worldwide British anti-slavery crusade as somehow motivated by economic self-interest, rather than by the kinds of moral imperatives activating the kinds of people that today's intellectuals find hard to understand. At the time, however, John Stuart Mill said that the British, for the last half-century, have spent annual sums equal to the revenue of a small kingdom in blockading the Africa coast, for a cause in which we not only had no interest, but which was contrary to our own pecuniary interest.
Yeah, very interesting, y'all. Let me know if you can hear me well. Seemed like my mic was acting a little weird today, but yeah, I've done some reading also where people made the claim that that Britain and the United States was acting in their own personal self-interest for some kind of financial gain. But everything I've seen so far has demonstrated that there was really nothing to gain financially from it. For any of the people in the West, any nation, there was really no financial gain. Thanks, hon. And Yeah, so I just don't understand I think it's just meant to continue. Thanks, Stevie. I think it's just meant to continue to belittle and minimize the actual good efforts, the good things that these people did. Again, no one's trying to minimize the horrors of slavery. We're not doing that. But what we're trying to do is break everything down and help everyone understand what really went on so that you can walk around and you're educated and you're knowledgeable about all the facts, the truths of slavery, the good and the bad. So that's what we do here.
While Britain spearheaded the anti-slavery movement in the world, the 19th century saw anti-slavery feelings spread until they became common throughout Western civilization, and only in Western civilization. By 1888, every country in the Western Hemisphere had abolished slavery, as had all European and European offshoot nations around the world. Yet attempts to abolish slavery in the non-Western world provoked armed uprisings within the Ottoman Empire. And elsewhere, peoples unable to directly mount challenges on the battlefield nevertheless engaged in massive evasions and concealments of their continued trade in human beings. After the open slave market in Istanbul was shut down, slaves continued to be smuggled in, often at night and in small groups, from the Caucasus and from around the Black Sea, among other places. Suppressing the slave trade across the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea was much harder and took much longer than suppressing the Atlantic slave trade. While slaves were transported across the Atlantic in large ships packed with their human cargoes, slaves were carried in smaller and more numerous vessels, along with rice, fish, and other merchandise, from East Africa to the Islamic world. British naval patrols were overwhelmed by the task of sorting out which of the innumerable Arab vessels were carrying slaves at a given time and place, and these patrols were never able to intercept more than a fraction of the slaves being shipped out of East Africa to the Islamic world of the Middle East and North Africa. Moreover, such success as the British had on the high seas led to a shifting of more of the slave trade to land, and especially to inland areas away from the ports and coastal outposts where British naval power could be exerted.
A quick question, y'all. Let me know for those of you who are familiar with this information and have engaged with people in discussions regarding slavery and what really went down and getting into more of the true history. Have you ever brought this information to someone who is maybe someone very heavily on the left, who is very anti-America, anti-West? Have you ever confronted them with this information? And if you have, what was the response? How did they push back, if at all, when presented with this information? Because I look at our current culture these days, when I look at everything that's happening and how there's so much hatred towards the history of the US, the history of the West, but when the reality of what happened in Africa, in the Middle East, how they fought vehemently to continue the slave trade, and how slavery is still ongoing in many of those nations. What's the argument? If slavery is the evil that we all know it to be, why isn't there more of a forceful outrage over the fact that slavery continued in other countries far longer than it did in the West? If anybody can comment down below, I'd love to hear if you've ever had that conversation with anybody who is very anti-America, anti-West. I'd love to hear their response. Let's continue. I'll get to your comment later as this episode progresses.
With the passage of time, however, especially as other European powers began to adopt anti-slavery policies, not only for themselves, but for other nations that they conquered or influenced, the slave trade was forced to retreat further, though not to surrender. Moreover, the retreat of the slave trade did not mean the abolition of slavery itself. A number of European nations, as well as the United States, officially banned the international slave trade in the early 19th century, and treaties among them decades later provided various means of making the ban more effective. But while nations could deter other nations from slave trading, it was much more difficult to deter freelance pirates or freelance marauders on land from capturing and selling people wherever a vulnerable source of supply might exist. Thus, North African pirates raided the Mediterranean coast in the 16th and 17th centuries, while pirates in Asia raided islands in the Philippines and sold the people captured to buyers in Borneo, the Celebes, and other islands in the Pacific. The Spanish colonial authorities who controlled the Philippines organized resistance against these pirates, but it was not until the United States took over the Philippines in 1898 that slave raiding was stopped. In the French colony of Senegal, slavery itself was still thriving as late as 1904, though the slave trade had been reduced earlier. The Portuguese did not put an end to the slave trade in their colony in Guinea until just before the First World War. Where European colonial military forces were spread thin and relied on indirect rule through indigenous authorities, as in much of Africa, local European colonial officials often found it expedient to turn a blind eye to the continued existence of slavery and the slave trade among the indigenous peoples, who saw nothing wrong with it and depended on it for a livelihood. However, this simply provided more fuel for exposés by European missionaries and journalists, leading eventually to still more pressure from the home governments to stamp out slavery. As one British historian put it, public opinion would not tolerate even vestigial slave trading in an area controlled by Britain. One sign of the difference between the history of slavery in Western and non-Western societies is the very different language used to describe the very different processes by which slavery was ended in these societies. For the European offshoot societies of the Western Hemisphere, the term was the abolition of slavery, while for Africa and the Middle East, the term was the decline of slavery, a much more uneven and protracted process in which local peoples continued the practice whenever and wherever they could escape the scrutiny or the power of European imperial authority.
One group was pressured into lowering the existence of slavery. In the meanwhile, all the while wanting it to continue, but trying to do it on the DL, on the down low, so they didn't get caught doing their dirt, continuing to enslave people, oftentimes that looked just like them or didn't look like them in many occasions, but they had a completely different philosophy when it came down to slavery. But whereas on the West, they wanted to eliminate it. That was the goal, because there was a cultural change that took place over the span of many, many decades. But it did happen. And when it happened quickly and it happened fiercely. As I mentioned in the previous episode, thanks to the efforts of men like William Wilberforce and all the other abolitionists who were outraged over the idea of a man being enslaved to another man.
In Asia as well, slavery continued to exist in backwaters and hinterlands on into the early 20th century. Writing in the last decade of the 20th century, a scholar observed, "Slavery in Southeast Asia is not a remote historical phenomenon. Laws certainly have prohibited private ownership of persons for a century or more. Yet in more hills and islands of the region, one still encounters people who admit to being slaves or the children of slaves." Even independent non-Western nations were pressured to end slavery, both directly and by a desire not to be embarrassed in the eyes of the world, meaning during the 19th century, mostly the powerful European world. In short, where European and European offshoot societies held direct and effective power in the 19th century, slavery was simply abolished. But where the Western world's power and influence were mediated, reduced, or otherwise operated only indirectly, their non-Western peoples were able to fight a long war of attrition and evasion in defense of slavery, a war which they had, however, largely lost by the middle of the 20th century, but which they had not yet wholly lost even at the beginning of the third millennium, when vestiges of slavery remained in parts of Africa. Despite all this, those with an instrumental view of history have managed to turn things upside down and present slavery as an evil of our society, or of the white race, or of Western civilization. One could as well do the same with murder or cancer, simply by ignoring these evils in other societies and incessantly denouncing their presence in the West. Yet what was peculiar about the West was not that it participated in the worldwide evil of slavery, but that it later abolished that evil, not only in Western societies, but also in other societies subject to Western control or influence. This was possible only because the anti-slavery movement coincided with an era in which Western power and hegemony were at their zenith, so that it was essentially European imperialism which ended slavery.
That last sentence alone would blow the minds of a lot of people. Western imperialism that ended slavery. Let's jump on to the next video here.
Many who are selectively indignant about the immorality of slavery in American society or in Western civilization do not merely pass over in silence the larger-scale slavery in other parts of the world.
Let me pause this real quick. I want to respond, Kabe. This isn't directly, I'm not directly talking about the Democratic Party. I'm primarily just giving a general history, a world history of slavery, and just revealing a lot of things that are not known to most modern audiences. That's primarily what I'm doing here. But good question. I appreciate it.
But sometimes even attempt to apologize for the latter. The argument often used by apologists for slavery in the antebellum American South, that slaves were treated like members of the family, has often been uncritically accepted for African or Middle Eastern societies, though dismissed out of hand for slavery in the United States. Some of the forms of involuntary servitude in non-Western societies have even been said to not have been really slavery, though scholars have differed among themselves on the definition of a slave.
For those of you who may be just jumping in and didn't see my earlier the videos I did earlier, do yourself a favor, go back and watch those videos. Because if you've ever heard that argument that, oh, well, in Africa, it wasn't really slavery, or the black folks in the United States that owned slaves, it wasn't real slavery, that may have been the case in some instances, but there is there's documentation to demonstrate the barbarism, how barbaric the slave trade was within these various cultures, within various African nations, amongst themselves, kidnapping other tribes that were close by and enslaving them and destroying their crops and killing other people. So it is a very real thing. And for some reason, it's an attempt to kind of whitewash the evils of slavery, which is silly. It needs to be understood in its fullest context so that we can actually, if we want to have outrage, we make sure that our outrage is properly placed.
The treatment of slaves has varied enormously, usually according to the kinds of work that slaves did. Around the world, plantation slaves have been almost universally treated worse than slaves used as domestic servants, for example. Given that plantation slavery was more common in the Western Hemisphere than in the Ottoman Empire, where slaves were more likely to be domestic servants, an argument could be made that the treatment of slaves in some societies was in general worse than in others. However, the high mortality rates and low reproduction rates of slaves in the Islamic countries should caution against accepting self-serving arguments that slaves were treated like members of the family in that part of the world.
And also, as was shown in the previous videos I did, creating eunuchs, cutting off these males' genitalia in order to keep them from procreating, to control the population, or for whatever reason, that happened a lot, especially in the Arab slave trade, which went on for decades after, even into, if I'm not mistaken, even into the 20th century. And some would even argue on many occasions that it still occurs today. And then again, in previous videos, like again, if you're just joining us, do yourself a favor, go back and check out these previous videos, because it was referenced how, in order to keep from getting caught from the Europeans, by the Americans, by the French, they would hit slaves over the head, throw them overboard. They would smash the heads of the babies. Evil stuff, y'all. So make sure that if you want to have a good understanding of what went down, watch all this content so you have a really solid understanding.
Any more than in the American South. The absence of a critical literature or an anti-slavery movement outside the West left the abuses of slaves in non-Western countries without the kind of exposure or denunciation that such abuses provoked in European and European offshoot societies. Even so, terrible mortality rates were known to exist among slaves in Egyptian salt mines or among slaves in Iraq. For all the domestic slavery of Africa, there were also slave plantations in East Africa and on the island of Zanzibar, and some African and Asian slave owners used their slaves as human sacrifices in religious ceremonies, as did the Mayans in the Western Hemisphere. Europeans enslaved by North Africans were often used as galley slaves, which could be killing work. But slaves or former slaves in non-Western countries did not have an audience for stories of their oppressions comparable to that of slaves or former slaves in the United States, where the experiences of Frederick Douglass and other former slaves were widely publicized outside the South. The lone exception would be the narratives of European slaves in North Africa after they were ransomed or escaped back to Europe, or the stories told by the smaller number of Americans who were enslaved in North Africa and then rescued by the U.S. Navy in the early 19th century. But the audiences for their stories were in the West, not in the Islamic countries where they had been enslaved.
They didn't care.
Moreover, the stories of white slaves in the Islamic world were of interest only in the West of their time, not in the West of our time, when such experiences are largely passed over in silence, like other historical facts that do not fit today's visions and agendas. Direct observation of the treatment of slaves was less common with domestic slaves living behind walls or galley slaves hidden in the bowels of ships, as distinguished from plantation slaves working out in open fields. However, what was directly observable in the Islamic world were the slave caravans which marched vast numbers of human beings from their homes where they had been captured to the places where they would be sold, hundreds of miles away, often after spending months crossing the burning sands of the Sahara. The death toll on these marches exceeded even the horrific toll on packed slave ships crossing the Atlantic. Slaves who could not keep up with the caravans were abandoned in the desert and left to die a lingering death from heat, thirst, and hunger. Thousands of human skeletons were strewn along one Saharan slave route alone, mostly the skeletons of young women and girls who were more in demand than men in much of the Islamic world.
Wow.
These skeletons tended to cluster in the vicinity of wells, suggesting their last desperate efforts to reach water. A letter from an Ottoman official in 1849 referred to 1,600 black slaves dying of thirst on their way to Libya. It has been estimated that, for every slave to reach Cairo alive, several died on the way. Whether or not the survivors were later treated better or worse than slaves in the Western Hemisphere after reaching their final destinations is by no means the whole story.
Man, it's so sad that when you hear these stories of people who really struggled and who were really mistreated, and people typically who have an agenda don't really care about this. So it demonstrates, it begs a question or makes you wonder, what's the true agenda? Like, what are they really after when they talk about the evils of the transatlantic slave trade, which they clearly were? But yeah, Rosalind, you nail it. Like, you're sitting up there, what a horrendous way to die. You're walking hundreds of miles, and then when you physically can't keep up, they leave you out there, leave you to die with the heat beating down on you. I mean, I was over in the Middle East during Operation Desert Storm, and I currently live in Vegas. So heat, the desert heat, I know it all too well. And it can get into far over 120 degrees. And you're talking about having to travel over an extended distance on foot without being conditioned for that, which most people truly aren't. That is a barbaric way to have your life taken from you. And again, oftentimes, growing up, never heard of this stuff. Never heard of this. That's the part that gets me, is growing up, I never heard anything like this. But I'm thankful that I know it now, because these people need to have their story shared. So do me a favor, if you appreciate this content, I'm going to say if you like it, if you appreciate this content, please share it so more people can know more of what's going on, or what happened in our history, in the history of our world. These people need to have their stories told.
While much of the history of the treatment of slaves has been presented as a history of the treatment of African slaves, the treatment of European slaves in North Africa and elsewhere was by no means benign. For example, this was the scene.
Let me pause real quick. This is an aspect of slavery that people definitely don't seem to care about. They don't even want to hear about it. When people reference the fact that there were white slaves, most people blow it off and say, "Oh, there were only a few," or they act as if they don't care.
In 18th century Algiers, as newly captured European slaves were paraded through town. Since the arrival of new slaves was a sign of prosperity and an occasion of civic pride for all the townsfolk, the resident Turks, Moors, Jews, and renegades all turned out to cheer and taunt the newcomers. Local children especially followed the slaves as they shuffled along, loudly humiliating them and sometimes threw refuse at them. The newly captured men's heads and beards were roughly shaved bare as part of the demoralization process to break their spirit, and slaves of either sex could be stripped naked for sale at auction. Most of the female slaves were used for domestic work, but the men tended to be used for work requiring strength, including the brutal and degrading work of galley slaves. When the ship was idle, slaves who needed to relieve themselves could make their way to the opening at the hull side of their bench, known as the borda, dragging their part of the chain and presumably climbing over their sleeping companions. "The only liberty that is given us in the galley," recalled Louis Marat, "is to go to this place when we have occasion." This, however, many slaves were apparently too exhausted or dispirited to do, and often ended up simply fouling themselves where they sat. The resulting stench, as many observers agreed, was beyond belief. But besides the fumes in which they labored, the shackled Gaiati were also tormented by rats, fleas, bedbugs, and other parasites. In the middle of the 16th century, galleys propelled by the rowing of slaves were common in the Mediterranean, among both Europeans and their Islamic neighbors and enemies. In their epic naval battle of Lepanto in 1571, an estimated 80,000 rowers propelled the galleys of the warring powers, and these rowers were mostly slaves. The need for galley slaves later declined as Europeans first began to rely on sails for power, so that by the late 1600s, galley slaves were found primarily in vessels from North Africa and the Middle East. Later, as sails became more common on Mediterranean vessels from the Islamic countries as well, the hideous work of galley slaves also declined. While North African pirates enslaved Europeans primarily from the countries around the Mediterranean, they occasionally ranged much farther afield. Some of these pirates sailed into the English Channel and even into the Thames estuary. A 17th century British parliamentary report said, "The fishermen are afraid to put to sea, and we are forced to keep continual watch on all our coasts." Nevertheless, Algerians were estimated to have captured more than 350 British ships between 1672 and 1682, which would mean that they enslaved a few hundred Britons annually. Earlier, in 1627, these pirates ranged even farther afield and raided Iceland, carrying off nearly 400 people into bondage. As late as the early 19th century, Barbary pirates captured American ships in the high seas and enslaved their crews. The phrase, "to the shores of Tripoli," is in the U.S. Marine Corps hymn because Marines were part of a naval expedition sent to rescue hundreds of Americans from bondage in North Africa and serve as a warning against further pirate attacks on American ships. Not all the captured Europeans became slaves. Some were ransomed, as were Americans. After a successful raid on a European coast, the pirates sometimes sailed out of sight and then returned a day or two later under a white flag to offer to sell some of their captives back to their families. This was especially effective when the captives were children or youths who might be brought before their parents in the custody of a fearsome and leering Moor to leave no doubt what awaited them in slavery, perhaps even before they arrived in Barbary. The story of how human beings treat other human beings when they have unbridled power over them is seldom a pretty story or even a decent story, regardless of the color of the people involved. When the roles were reversed, Africans did not treat Europeans any better than Europeans treated Africans. Neither can be exempted from moral condemnation applied to the other.
Really sad, y'all. Let's continue.
The situation in the Islamic world was very different from that in the West. Despite the larger total numbers of slaves sent from Africa to the Islamic world over the centuries, the surviving African population in these countries was much less than the tens of millions in the Western Hemisphere. In addition to higher mortality rates of slaves en route to North African and Middle Eastern countries, the survival and reproduction rates of African slaves there were much less than in the United States. While slaves in the antebellum South lived in families, even though they lacked official legal sanction for their marriages, both marriage and casual sex among slaves were suppressed in the Islamic world, and among the relatively small numbers of children born to African slaves there, the mortality rate was so high that few lived to adulthood. The sex imbalance among African slaves, far more women than men in the Islamic countries, and the fact that eunuchs were common among the relatively few African men, likewise precluded a vast African slave population in the Muslim countries. Among the European galley slaves in North Africa, there was even less chance for them to reproduce, and the European women who were domestic servants or concubines were in no position to leave behind European offspring raised in a European culture. The children born to them, fathered by North African or Middle Eastern slave owners, were absorbed both biologically and culturally into the Islamic world. By the late 18th century, visitors were commenting on the lighter complexions of the inhabitants of Algiers. What the United States had that the Islamic world did not have was a self-sustaining and racially distinct population of major proportions within the larger society. Non-Western countries in general faced neither the social nor the moral dilemmas that confronted 19th century Americans. Moreover, the emancipation of slaves was not an issue faced by non-Western societies, but rather was something imposed on them by the West. Even European powers with substantial slave populations in their Western Hemisphere colonies faced no major domestic social consequences from the freeing of those slaves, however much that might have economic repercussions, for their slaves were freed on the other side of the ocean. Both slavery and emancipation were peculiar in their consequences on American soil. It may be significant that the only other independent nation in the Western Hemisphere with a large slave population, Brazil, was the last Western nation to abolish the institution, a quarter of a century after the United States.
Yeah, the more you hear, the sadder it seems to get, honestly. Oops. Hold on 1 second, y'all. All right, was the West the next section? Oh, by the way, I want to give props. Let me switch this up here real quick. By the way, I want to give props to the YouTube channel where I'm getting this information. It's Soul, Sowell. For those of you who aren't familiar with Thomas Sowell, the channel is Soul Explains. Soul Explains is the YouTube channel. The next segment we're going to be discussing is, was the West built on slavery? Something that you often hear.
Slavery has left many legacies, some economic, some social, some psychological, some political, and most detrimental. Those who think of slavery in economic terms often assume that it is a means by which a society, or at least its non-slave population, becomes richer. Some have even claimed that the Industrial Revolution in Western civilization was based on the profits extracted from the exploitation of slaves. Rather than rehash a large and controversial literature on this issue, we may instead look at the economic condition of countries or regions that used vast numbers of slaves in the past. Both in Brazil and in the United States, the countries with the two largest slave populations in the Western Hemisphere, the end of slavery found the regions in which slaves had been concentrated poorer than other regions of these same countries.
That's a very good point. Because I've heard on so many occasions people saying how slavery built this country, and I'm not referencing the backs of slavery, like how slaves were used. And even then, largely that was primarily in the South. But as far as how profitable slavery was to those slave traders, those slave owners, it wasn't really what people think.
For the United States, a case could be made that this was due to the Civil War, which did so much damage to the South. But no such explanation would apply to Brazil, which fought no civil war over this issue. Moreover, even in the United States, the South lagged behind the North in many ways, even before the Civil War.
Yep.
Although slavery in Europe died out before it was abolished in the Western Hemisphere, as late as 1776, slavery had not yet died out all across the continent when Adam Smith wrote in The Wealth of Nations that it still existed in some eastern regions. But even then, Eastern Europe was much poorer than Western Europe. The slavery of North Africa and the Middle East over the centuries took more slaves from sub-Saharan Africa than the Western Hemisphere did, in addition to large imports of slaves from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe to the Muslim countries of North Africa and the Middle East. But these remained largely poor countries until the discovery and extraction of their vast oil deposits. In many parts of the non-Western world, slaves were sources of domestic amenities and means of displaying wealth with an impressive retinue, rather than sources of wealth. Often, they were a drain on the wealth already possessed. According to a scholarly study of slavery in China, the slaves there did not generate any surplus, they consumed it. Another study concluded, the Middle East and the Arab world rarely used slaves for productive activities. Even though some slave owners, those whose slaves produced commercial crops or other saleable products, received wealth from the fruits of the unpaid labor of these slaves. That is very different from saying that the society as a whole, or even its non-slave population as a whole, ended up wealthier than it would have been in the absence of slavery.
So what he's saying to some degree was that some people own slaves, and this is what I'm getting from it, that there were some people who owned slaves in order for like a status symbol, to demonstrate that they were doing well, that they were doing well financially. Crazy. Again, this demonstrates the true heart of man, how the heart of man is deceitful and desperately wicked. Jeremiah 17:9.
Not only in societies where slaves were more often consumers than producers of wealth, but even in societies where commercial slavery was predominant, this did not automatically translate into enduring wealth. Unlike a frugal capitalist class, such as created the Industrial Revolution, even commercial slave owners in the American antebellum South tended to spend lavishly, often ending up in debt or even losing their plantations to foreclosures by creditors. However, even if British slave owners had saved and invested all of their profits from slavery, it would have amounted to less than 2% of British domestic investment.
Wow.
In the United States, it is doubtful whether the profits of slavery would have covered the enormous costs of the Civil War, a war that was fought over the immediate issue of secession. But the reason for the secession was to safeguard slavery from the growing anti-slavery sentiment outside the South, symbolized by the election of Abraham Lincoln. Brazil, which had several times as many slaves as the United States, and perhaps consumed more slaves than any other nation in history, was nevertheless still a relatively undeveloped country when slavery ended there in 1888. And its subsequent economic development was largely the work of immigrants from Europe and Japan. In short, even though some individual slave owners grew rich and some family fortunes were founded on the exploitation of slaves, that is very different from saying that the whole society, or even its non-slave population as a whole, was more economically advanced than it would have been in the absence of slavery. What this means is that whether employed as domestic servants or producing crops or other goods, millions suffered exploitation and dehumanization for no higher purpose than the transient aggrandizement of slave owners.
We'll do one more section for the day, I think.
Just as enslaved peoples tend to be despised, so the work done by slaves tended to acquire social stigmas in countries around the world. In Java, for example, free people did not want to carry their own packages, since slaves carried packages, and therefore free people without slaves would hire a slave for such chores. Similarly, in Egypt, work done by slaves was spurned by working-class people, even after slavery was over. Sometimes it was not just particular kinds of work, but hard work in general, or work under the direction of a foreman or overseer that was stigmatized. Just as great conquerors like the Mongols or the Spaniards disdained commerce as beneath them, so ordinary people in slave societies disdained many kinds of work because it had been done by slaves. One consequence of this was that immigrants with a work ethic, such as Italian immigrants to Brazil and Argentina, who often entered such societies much poorer than the existing white populations of these countries, began at the bottom by working at many tasks that local whites disdained, and ultimately rose to a higher economic plane than the whites who had been born there. Whatever their initial disadvantages, the immigrants were not burdened with the native-born whites' aversions to work. Former slaves and the descendants of slaves likewise developed aversions to tasks performed under slavery. In the British West Indies, for example, blacks, after emancipation, left the plantations in such numbers that a whole new plantation workforce had to be imported from India to replace them. The economic costs of such attitudes, deriving from slavery and continuing for generations thereafter, cannot be quantified, but also cannot be dismissed as negligible. Where slaves and slave owners have been of visibly different races, then the racial animosities and distrust deriving from the era of slavery may also last for many generations after slavery itself is over, leading to economic and psychic costs to individuals as well as social costs to nations. Although the negative economic consequences of slavery, including consequences among generations born long after slavery itself was ended, cannot be quantified, the patterns of lasting economic lags in regions where slavery was widespread may nevertheless be suggestive. In the United States, and no doubt some other societies, one of the major psychological legacies of slavery has been a sense of shame and resentment among the black population, and a sense of guilt among the white population. The reiterated depiction of enslavement as a peculiarly black experience falsely makes this seem to be a uniquely shameful fate to which a particular race submitted, requiring for some of their descendants compensatory bombast from themselves and, if possible, compensatory benefits to be extracted from others. To whites, the false depiction of the history of slavery makes some feel uniquely guilty and responsible for the current misfortunes of blacks. Such attitudes, and the many cross-currents they generate, are hardly the framework for a rational discussion or resolution of today's social issues.
You know, and I know there are people who have different opinions when it comes down to the issue of reparations, but my mindset is this, is that when it comes down to the ugly history of slavery and all the things that came, the Black Code, Jim Crow laws, is that our nation as a whole has done a lot to make amends for those past evils. When we talk about, the Civil Rights Acts that took place in the 60s, and how our nation has enforced so many new laws and new amendments regarding education. I think there have been so many things that have been put in place to address the issue of equality and in treating people fairly, that I believe that our nation has gone above and beyond. Not to mention the fact that that most people who were truly impacted, well, the people that were impacted by slavery are all gone. Now, there's no doubt that there's impact that can have throughout generations, but when we understand, and that's another thing that Thomas Sowell addresses, when we look at the issue of the plight of the Black community, post-racism, post-slavery, when we look at the state of the Black community post-slavery, we can understand that the family was more intact, that our employment rate was increasing exponentially, greater than any other ethnic group in our country at the time. And it wasn't until around the time of the Great Society and basically the war on poverty, when the welfare state kicked in, is when we really started struggling and going downward, where there were more children were raised in single parent homes where the fathers were absent. And we can go on, and most of y'all probably already heard a lot of this, but I think it gets minimized in our society these days. The impact, slavery, the residual impact of slavery, in my opinion, is primarily gone. What we're seeing now in our society, from my perspective, is the impact of a godless society, an increasingly secularized society, the sexual revolution, and the welfare state. That's what we're seeing primarily in our nation. And that's what's doing us the vast amount of harm. Those three factors primarily. But I'd like to know what you guys think. Comment down below as the video continues on. What do you think are the main things that have negatively impacted our society, in particularly the minority community, the Black community, mostly?
The physical and psychic sufferings of slaves in the past are neither necessary nor sufficient to explain the economic and other differences between their present-day descendants and members of the general population.
Here we go.
The economic and other disparities between Europeans and Africans living, respectively, in Europe and Africa are vastly greater than the disparities between the descendants of Europeans and Africans living in the United States. The latter have not lost, but gained economically from living in the United States. That these gains derive from the tragic fate of their ancestors does not make them any less gains, over and above where these descendants would be today if their ancestors had been left alone in peace in their homeland. This cannot morally justify the seizing of their ancestors. It simply affects the cause and effect question of the reasons for Black-white disparities today.
Very interesting.
Often, the economic lags or social pathology of American Blacks have been blamed on a legacy of slavery.
Here we go.
Whether it is the dearth of marriages and families among contemporary Blacks, or their lower labor force participation than whites, or their high crime rates, slavery has often been invoked as an explanation. Yet the fact is that in the late 19th century, when Blacks were just one generation out of slavery, there was nothing like today's level of unwed births or failure to participate in the labor force. It has been from the 1960s onward that these social pathologies have escalated. Whatever the cause, it has risen long after slavery had ended. Two very different questions have been confused as regards the history of Black families. 1. Why marriage rates differ between Blacks and whites, and 2. Why marriage rates among Blacks are much lower now than in the past. Official census data show that Blacks had slightly higher marriage rates than whites for every census from 1890 to 1940, but far lower marriage rates than whites by 1960. On the Black-white difference, some have argued that the census data from the late 19th and early 20th centuries are misleading, that Black unmarried women with children in that era called themselves widows to avoid the embarrassment of being unwed mothers, even though the mortality rate among Black men was not enough to account for so many widows. Interestingly enough, those who argued this way offered no explanation for the high rate of marriage among Black men during that same era, since unmarried fathers were unlikely to have children living with them to require them to pretend to be married when they were not. As of 1940, for example, from 66 to 70% of non-white males in age brackets from 30 and up reported themselves in the census as married and living with a spouse. Adding those Black males who were widowers, separated, or divorced, more than 3/4 of Black males had been married, despite being only the third generation after slavery. However one resolves the question of the Black-white differences in rates of married and unwed motherhood, the more fundamental question as regards the legacy of slavery argument is why Black marriage rates began a precipitous decline in 1960, nearly a century after the end of slavery.
I think the points that I brought up are the main ones. Sexual revolution, the increased secularization of our society, and the welfare state. When a woman was incentivized, that you get extra cash if you're a single mom from the government. And some women out there were motivated to do just so.
While the percentage of first births that were premarital has long differed as between Blacks and whites, as it differed between antebellum white Southerners and white Northerners, and between other groups around the world in places where slavery cannot be invoked as an explanation, the sharp increase in premarital first births among Blacks began in the 1960s. From 1930 to 1934, 31% of first births to Black women were premarital, while from 1990 to 1994, 77% were.
That is more than double. That is insane. Those are insane numbers. But again, our culture has shifted dramatically. Our culture has shifted dramatically. I think clearly racism was more prevalent back then, but just if you read the writings of people like Booker T. Washington, many of the old slaves, some of the old slave writings, you'll see such a reverence for God and activity, church-related activities, and it was just more of a part of our society. And you can't minimize the impact that godlessness has on any society. When you believe that there is no God, everything's permissible, basically.
Moreover, whereas in 1930 to 1934, premarital births plus the births of children conceived before marriage but born after marriage were together still a minority in all Black births. By 1994, these two categories constituted 86% of all Black births.
Jeez.
That such a legacy of slavery would take nearly a century to appear strains credulity.
This is another thing I love about Thomas Sowell and his writings. He gives you the data, he gives you the facts, he gives you the information, and then it's like it's up to you what you choose to do with it. You can ignore it, or you can say, this is really challenging my worldview. What am I going to do with it? When I was confronted with this information, I wasn't some rabid, blame Whitey, blame the white man. I don't mean to be offensive to anybody, but I think you get my point. I wasn't that bad. But of course, I looked at situations, I looked at our history. Roots was where I got my information, a lot of my information about slavery. It was a good portion of it. But when I was confronted with information like this, it's like, what are you going to do with it? Are you going to ignore it? And as a Christian man, I'm a big proponent of truth and understanding that what the Proverbs talks about, the first to plead his case seems right until another comes and challenges him. So, and that has pretty much been a mantra of mine in recent years, especially in light of all the police shootings and allegations of racism and all this. So many times when you see a video and that video is given to you, if you don't take the time to examine the information that you're given and wait until you get more information, you're more than likely going to get fooled and embarrassed. It happens all the time. So your best bet is to wait until you gain more information. So that has become my go-to in almost every situation. I get information, I evaluate it, I read it, I study it. I try to find out if there's any counterpoints to the argument that's being made or that's being presented to me, and then I take it from there. So let me know what y'all think about this whole. If you want me to continue on making more content referencing these videos and giving a bit of my perspective on it, let me know. If you want me to continue doing this by commenting in the chat, if you're watching me live, or in the comment section as well. I probably can make another 6-7 videos on this topic alone. And I'm just thankful for the opportunity to be able to share some of this and voice my opinion. I appreciate y'all being here and listening in as we go. Again, y'all, if you're just coming by Code Red Conversations and you appreciate the dialogue that I'm having, this is what I do. I take a lot of pop culture issues and I address them biblically to the best of my ability. And I just try to share this information and share my perspective as a former cop, as a Christian man who's passionate about defending the faith, passionate about truth. So if you appreciate this kind of content, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button, give me a follow, share my content if you would be so kind. And again, if you want more content like this addressing the issue of slavery, let me know in the chat, let me know in the comment section, and we'll continue on. Again, I appreciate y'all. God bless y'all for being here. And as always, you know the routines. Stay safe, God bless, and make sure you join the conversation. I'm out, y'all.